While I fought cancer, my husband David mocked my hair loss and skipped my treatments for cycling trips. Then I found out his training camp was really a weekend with another woman. By the end of the week, he couldn't even sit down without wincing, and everyone knew why. My name is Helen Morrison, and 6 months ago, if you had told me I would become the kind of woman who plots elaborate revenge involving chili peppers and cycling shorts, I would have prescribed you a psychiatric evaluation. I was a nurse for 23 years at Manchester Royal Infirmary. I believed in healing, in helping people, in standing by your loved ones through sickness and health. Unfortunately, it turns out not everyone took those same vows as seriously as I did. At 49, I thought I had life figured out. 18 years of marriage to David, a comfortable semi-detached in Chorlton, and what I believed was a partnership built on mutual respect. David had his cycling obsession, which naturally required more equipment than a small hospital, and I had my nursing career. We weren't the couple that finished each other's sentences, but we were steady, reliable, or so I thought. Then blood cancer arrived like an uninvited guest who decides to redecorate your entire life. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by Dr. Patel with the kind of gentle precision that told me she'd done this conversation before, too many times. "We caught it early," she said, which in medical speak translates to, "You're not dying immediately, but we need to pump you full of chemicals that will make you feel like you're dying slowly." David's reaction to my diagnosis was, shall we say, less than inspiring. While I was processing the fact that my own blood had turned against me, David was calculating how this would affect his weekend cycling schedule. "How long will the treatments take?" was his first question. Not "how are you feeling?" or "what can I do to help?" but a logistics inquiry that would have made a shipping manager proud. The first chemotherapy session was scheduled for a Thursday. David drove me to the hospital with the enthusiasm of someone headed to a tax audit. "I'll pick you up when it's done," he said, already checking his phone for Strava notifications. "It's just sitting in a chair for a few hours, right?" Just sitting in a chair. If only cancer treatment were that simple. The infusion center at the hospital was a special kind of purgatory. Rows of recliners filled with people hooked to IV poles like some dystopian charging station for humans. The nurses were angels, truly, but even angels can't make chemotherapy pleasant. The drugs they pumped into my veins were designed to kill fast-growing cells, and unfortunately, my body couldn't tell the difference between cancer cells and hair follicles. I sat there for 4 hours, watching the bag of liquid poison slowly drip into my arm, surrounded by other patients whose partners held their hands, brought them books, or simply sat quietly offering presents. David, meanwhile, was completing a 20-mile training ride through the Peak District. His Strava app later informed me he'd achieved a personal best on 3 segments. Apparently, my cancer diagnosis was quite motivating for his athletic performance. The hair loss started 2 weeks later. I woke up one morning to find my pillow covered in what looked like the aftermath of a particularly aggressive haircut. When I showed David the handfuls of auburn hair that had once been my pride, his response was a masterclass in sensitivity. "At least you'll finally save money on haircuts," he said with what I can only describe as a smirk. "And if the little mustache goes too, you might even look younger." The little mustache. Ladies and gentlemen, my husband of 18 years had just compared my cancer-induced hair loss to male pattern balding. I stood there holding clumps of my own hair, and he was making jokes about facial hair I didn't even know I had. The NHS should really include a pamphlet about how cancer reveals the true character of the people around you. It would save everyone a lot of time. As the weeks progressed, David's behavior established a pattern that would have been impressive in its consistency if it weren't so consistently awful. He missed every single follow-up appointment, but never once skipped his weekend group ride with the Manchester Cycling Club. When I struggled to cook dinner during my week periods, which, for the record, felt like having the flu while someone slowly drained your life force through a cocktail straw, his commentary was always constructive. "This is bland," he'd announce, pushing around the simple pasta I'd managed to prepare, despite feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. I need proper food if I'm going to train seriously. Proper food, as if my cancer treatment was somehow interfering with his nutritional requirements. I began ordering takeaway on my worst days, my hands shaking as I counted out coins, while David meal prepped his cycling nutrition with the precision of a professional athlete. He had protein powders that cost more than my anti-nausea medication, and energy bars arranged in his cycling kit like tiny edible soldiers preparing for war. The financial priorities became particularly clear during what I now call the medication incident. I was at the pharmacy, counting coins to afford the anti-nausea pills that made the difference between functioning and lying in bed, wishing for death. 15 pounds. Not exactly a fortune, but when you're on sick leave and watching every penny, it might as well have been 1,500. Meanwhile, David had just spent 400 pounds on new cycling shorts. Not 4 pounds, not 40 pounds, but 400 pounds. For shorts, with padding. They're performance shorts, he explained, modeling them in our bedroom mirror like he was preparing for the Tour de France rather than a weekend ride through Cheshire. The padding makes all the difference for long distances. I would have laughed if I weren't so exhausted from trying not to vomit. My husband was investing in bottom comfort while I was rationing medication to afford groceries. The irony was so thick you could have served it with his performance nutrition smoothies. By my 3rd month of treatment, I had become invisible in my own home. David spoke about his cycling achievements with the passion of a war correspondent. But my cancer might as well have been a minor inconvenience, like a roadwork delay on his usual route. He never mentioned my condition to his cycling friends. I knew this because when I bumped into Sarah Mitchell at Tesco, her husband rode with David's group, she cheerfully asked how I was doing, clearly having no idea I was fighting for my life. "Oh, David never mentioned," she started, then stopped, her face changing as she processed what she was seeing. The headscarf wasn't exactly subtle, and neither was the general look of someone whose body was at war with itself. That's when I realized David was living 2 separate lives. In one life, he was married to a woman dying of cancer. In the other, he was a carefree cyclist whose biggest concern was whether to upgrade his wheels or his handlebars. Apparently, he much preferred the second life. The breaking point came on a Thursday in June. I was in the kitchen trying to keep down some toast and mentally preparing for my next chemo session when David made an announcement that would change everything. "I'll be gone for 3 days," he said, adjusting his cycling jersey with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted their own importance. "Big training camp with the club. Don't wait up." 3 days. My next treatment was scheduled for Friday, and David was planning to be at a training camp. I looked at him. This man I had shared a bed with for 18 years, and saw a stranger who was apparently more committed to his hobby than to his dying wife. "When did the club organize this?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. 23 years of nursing had taught me to gather information before making diagnoses. "Last-minute thing," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "You know how these opportunities come up." Actually, I didn't know. The Manchester Cycling Club was run with military precision by a retired sergeant major named Colin, who planned events 6 months in advance and sent out schedules that would have impressed NASA. Last-minute opportunities were about as common as unicorns. That night, after David had gone to bed, I did something I had never done in 18 years of marriage. I checked up on him. The club's website was a monument to Colin's organizational skills, complete with a training calendar that detailed every ride, every event, and every camping trip for the next year. According to the official schedule, the next training camp was planned for July, not this weekend. I stared at my laptop screen, feeling something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't disappointment. That ship had sailed months ago. It was clarity. My husband was lying to me. While I was fighting cancer, David was living a secret life. Friday morning, after David left with his overnight bag and enough cycling gear to outfit a small army, I called the cycling club. I told them I was David's wife and that he might have left his wallet at the training camp, asking if anyone had turned it in. The secretary, a lovely woman named Margaret who volunteered her time to keep Colin's empire running, sounded genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but we haven't had a training camp this month. David wasn't signed up for anything this weekend." I hung up and sat in my empty kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion. My husband of 18 years had just lied to me with the casual ease of someone who had clearly had practice. While I was counting coins for medication, he was planning secret weekends away. The question was, away with whom? The weekend stretched ahead like a prison sentence. David sent cheerful texts about tough training sessions and early bedtimes that read like dispatches from an alternate universe. I spent my time researching, which probably wasn't the healthiest activity for someone whose immune system was already compromised by chemotherapy, but I had to know. Saturday evening, I did something else I had never done. I drove to the locations David's texts claimed he was visiting. The training camp was supposedly at a center in the Lake District, a 3-hour drive from Manchester. According to David's messages, they were having a brutal hill session, followed by team dinner. The training center was closed for renovations, had been for 6 weeks, according to the sign on the gate. David's team dinner was apparently taking place at a facility that was currently home to nothing but scaffolding and construction equipment. Sunday night, David returned with the satisfied glow of someone who had thoroughly enjoyed their weekend. He smelled of expensive aftershave and restaurant food, not the usual combination of sweat and energy bars that accompanied his genuine cycling trips. While he showered, singing some pop song that was clearly stuck in his head, I made my final investigation. His phone was charging on the bedside table, and for the first time in our marriage, I looked through it. What I found there would have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. David had apparently discovered the art of digital romance with all the subtlety of a teenager. The photos told the whole story. David with a brunette woman at what was clearly a Lake District cycling event, but not the one he had described to me. They were holding hands, arms around each other, looking like a couple celebrating something special. Her name, according to the contact list, was Emma. According to their text thread, they had been celebrating quite a few special things. "Best ride ever," read one of her messages. "You and me, the real team." The real team. I sat there in my pajamas, bald head covered by a scarf that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, reading about my husband's real team while his fake team wife fought cancer alone. I scrolled through weeks of messages that painted a picture of a relationship that had clearly been developing while I was developing tumors. Emma was a fellow cyclist, divorced, child-free, and apparently everything that a cancer patient could never be: energetic, athletic, and blissfully unaware of what it felt like to have poison pumped through your veins on a weekly basis. The texts were a masterclass in modern romance. David complained about his difficult home situation and his challenging marriage, painting himself as a devoted husband trapped with an increasingly difficult wife. Emma responded with sympathy and suggestions for weekend getaways that coincidentally aligned with my treatment schedule. I took screenshots of everything. 23 years of nursing had taught me to document thoroughly, and this was no different from charting a patient's decline. The evidence was clear. While I was fighting for my life, my husband was building a new one that didn't include me. I closed the phone and looked at David, asleep in our bed, snoring the contented snore of someone whose conscience was clearly untroubled. For the first time in months, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt anger, clean, pure, energizing anger. "He thinks I'm weak because cancer is making me weak," I whispered to the darkness. "Let me show him what strength really looks like." At 2:45 a.m., I made my way to the kitchen and brewed a cup of ginger tea. The ginger helped with the nausea, but more importantly, it helped me think clearly. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared 18 years of meals, where David had announced his cycling achievements, and I had listened with what I now realized was misplaced pride. And I planned. David's cycling kit was stored in our converted garage with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. His bikes hung on custom racks, his jerseys were arranged by season, and his various shorts and accessories were organized with military precision. It was, I had to admit, an impressive display of obsessive behavior masquerading as dedication. I focused on the shorts. David owned 7 pairs of cycling shorts, ranging from his everyday training pairs to his special event shorts that had cost more than my monthly medication budget. Each pair featured padding designed to make long-distance cycling comfortable. Padding that, I realized, could be modified to achieve the opposite effect. In our kitchen, I grew herbs and vegetables in small pots on the windowsill. Nothing fancy, just basic cooking ingredients that helped stretch our grocery budget. Among them were scotch bonnet chilies, small, innocent-looking peppers that packed approximately 350,000 Scoville units of heat. I had planted them after watching a cooking show that claimed they added authentic Caribbean flavor to dishes. I was about to discover they could add authentic discomfort to cycling experiences. I worked methodically, like I was preparing medication. Each pair of shorts was turned inside out, the padding examined and noted. I rubbed fresh chili pepper into the fabric, paying special attention to the areas that would make contact with sensitive parts of the anatomy. The capsaicin, the compound that makes peppers hot, would absorb into the fabric and create a slow-building burn that would intensify with friction and body heat. It was, I realized, the perfect revenge. David's pride was wrapped up in his cycling ability, his connection to the club, his athletic identity. He would be humiliated in front of the very people he valued most, and everyone would assume it was his own fault. Some kind of allergic reaction or poor hygiene decision. I folded each pair of shorts with the same care David used to arrange them, returning everything to its precise position. For the finishing touch, I visited our ensuite bathroom and gave David's electric toothbrush a thorough rinse in toilet water. It seemed appropriate somehow. If he was going to have a filthy mouth about our marriage, he might as well have the oral hygiene to match. Finally, I tucked a note under the chili jar in our pantry. True strength burns from within. You'll feel it soon. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that Manchester rarely provided. David bounded out of bed with the enthusiasm of someone looking forward to another day of living his secret life. He dressed in his cycling kit with the ritual precision of a knight, donning armor, completely unaware that his armor had been sabotaged by the wife he considered too weak to fight back. "Big ride today," he announced, checking his appearance in the mirror. "Might be out for 6 hours." 6 hours with Emma, no doubt, followed by whatever romantic activities they had planned for the evening. I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the supportive wife one last time. "Have a wonderful ride," I said, meaning every word in ways he would never understand. The Manchester Cycling Club met every Saturday at 9 a.m. in the Tesco car park on Wilmslow Road. It was a gathering of 30 or so middle-aged men and a handful of women, all dressed in clothing that cost more than most people spent on their cars. I had seen them before, of course, but had never paid much attention to the social dynamics. From my car across the street, I watched David arrive with his usual swagger. He was riding his newest bike, a carbon fiber creation that had cost more than my annual medication budget, and wearing what I recognized as his special occasion shorts, the same shorts that were now infused with enough capsaicin to strip paint. I had brought my phone and positioned myself with a clear view of the proceedings. After months of being invisible, I was finally going to witness something worth watching. The group set off promptly at 9:15, a colorful parade of middle-aged athleticism heading toward the Cheshire countryside. David was in his element, chatting with other riders, probably planning how to slip away for another rendezvous with Emma. I followed at a discreet distance in my car, feeling like a private investigator tracking a particularly unimaginative adultery case. 10 minutes into the ride, something wonderful happened. David suddenly jerked upright on his bike, his casual posture replaced by something that looked distinctly uncomfortable. I watched through my windscreen as he shifted in his seat, trying to find a position that didn't make him grimace. "Problem, Dave," I heard someone shout. The acoustics of the countryside carried voices beautifully. No problem," David called back, but his voice had a strained quality that suggested otherwise. He was clearly feeling the first effects of my chili pepper modification, a warm tingle that would gradually build to something much more intense. 5 minutes later, the tingle had apparently become something more urgent. David was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting constantly on his saddle and falling behind the main group. The friction of cycling was activating the capsaicin, turning his expensive shorts into a torture device that would have impressed medieval interrogators. "Dave, what's wrong?" called out Colin, the club sergeant major, slowing his pace to check on a struggling member. "You look like you're sitting on a cactus." The group began to notice David's distress, cycling around him with the concerned confusion of people witnessing something they had never seen before. David's face was turning an interesting shade of red that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the fact that his most sensitive areas were currently experiencing what could only be described as chemical warfare. "It's nothing," David gasped, but his voice suggested it was very much something. He tried to dismount his bike to relieve the pressure, but standing up only seemed to make things worse. The chili-infused fabric was now in full contact with skin that had never experienced anything more challenging than premium cycling shorts. The group stopped completely as David began what could only be described as a bow-legged dance of agony. He was making sounds that were part grunt, part whimper, and entirely undignified. Several club members had their phones out, apparently thinking this was either a medical emergency or prime social media content. "Never seen anything like it," I heard one rider comment. "Looks like he's got chili powder in his shorts or something." If only they knew how accurate that observation was. David's humiliation was complete when he attempted to remount his bike and immediately yelped in pain. The sound echoed across the Cheshire countryside like the cry of an injured animal. The Manchester Cycling Club, a group that prided itself on conquering challenging terrain and adverse weather conditions, was being defeated by David's unfortunate encounter with Caribbean peppers. "I think you need to head home, mate," Colin suggested with the kind of concern usually reserved for serious injuries. "Whatever's going on, cycling isn't going to help." David nodded frantically, clearly desperate to escape the curious stares of his fellow cyclists. He climbed gingerly back onto his expensive bike and began the most uncomfortable ride of his cycling career, 6 miles back to the car park while fighting the urge to scream. I followed his painful progress from my car, watching as he stopped every few hundred meters to adjust his position, stand up on his pedals, or simply grimace at the sky. By the time he reached the car park, word had already spread through the club's WhatsApp group. I could see other members checking their phones and glancing at David with expressions that ranged from sympathy to barely suppressed amusement. David loaded his bike onto his car with the careful movements of someone whose entire lower body was staging a rebellion. I watched him drive away, knowing that his day was about to get considerably worse when he discovered the evidence I had compiled of his secret relationship. I returned home and calmly began packing a suitcase. I had already arranged to stay with my sister Claire in Liverpool while I figured out my next steps. Claire was divorced herself and had always believed that David was, in her words, a bit too fond of himself. She was going to enjoy this story immensely. David arrived home 30 minutes later, walking with the distinctive gait of someone who had lost a fight with spicy food. I was sitting in our living room, suitcase by my feet, when he came through the door looking like he had survived some kind of natural disaster. "What happened to you?" I asked with the innocent concern of a wife who definitely hadn't sabotaged her husband's cycling shorts with capsaicin. "I don't know," he replied, his voice strained. "Something's wrong with my shorts. It's like they're on fire." "How strange," I murmured. "Perhaps you should change into something more comfortable." David hobbled toward our bedroom, apparently planning to address his uncomfortable situation, but stopped when he saw my suitcase. Going somewhere? He asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was a weekend spa trip rather than something more permanent. Yes, I replied calmly. I found some interesting photos on your phone last night. Would you like to see them? I had printed out the screenshots of his romantic weekend with Emma, along with selected highlights from their text conversations. David's face cycled through several expressions as he processed what he was seeing: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally, the look of someone who had been caught red-handed. Helen, I can explain. Can you? I interrupted. Can you explain why you told me you were at a cycling camp that was actually closed for renovations? Can you explain why your team dinner took place at a restaurant 60 miles from where you claim to be? Can you explain who Emma is and why she thinks you're unhappy in your marriage? David's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The evidence was photographic and comprehensive, and we both knew it. It's not what it looks like, he tried, which was possibly the least convincing defense in the history of adultery. It looks like my husband has been having an affair while I undergo chemotherapy, I replied. If it's not that, I'd be fascinated to hear your alternative explanation. David tried several different approaches. It was a misunderstanding. Emma was just a friend. The photos were taken out of context. I was being paranoid due to medication side effects. Each excuse was more ridiculous than the last, and I listened with the patience of someone who no longer had any emotional investment in the conversation. Helen, please, he said finally, apparently realizing that his legal defense was falling apart. I made a mistake. I was confused. The cancer thing has been really hard on me, too. The cancer thing. My life-threatening illness had been reduced to the cancer thing, and apparently it had been harder on him than on me. The man who was currently unable to sit down due to chili pepper poisoning was claiming to be the real victim in this situation. You're right, I said, standing up and collecting my suitcase. Cancer has been really difficult. It's shown me exactly who you are when I need you most. And what you are is a man who abandons his dying wife to go cycling with his girlfriend. Where are you going? David asked, panic creeping into his voice. To my sister's house, I replied, to recover from cancer and from you. I'm not sure which is going to take longer. As I reached the door, David made one final attempt at reconciliation. Helen, wait. We can work this out. I'll end things with Emma. I'll be better. Just don't leave. I turned back to look at him one last time. This man I had loved for 18 years, now standing bow-legged in our hallway, begging me not to leave him alone with the consequences of his choices. David, I said gently, I spent months thinking cancer was going to kill me. It turns out watching you betray me while I fought for my life was much worse. I survived cancer. I'll definitely survive losing you. I left him standing there, probably wondering whether his immediate concern should be saving his marriage or treating his chemical burns. I suspect the burns won, since they were causing more immediate discomfort than the prospect of losing the wife he had already discarded. The drive to Claire's house was the first peaceful journey I had taken in months. My phone rang constantly, David calling with increasing desperation. But I had discovered the liberating power of the decline call button. Each unanswered call felt like shedding another layer of obligation I had never actually agreed to carry. Claire welcomed me with tea, sympathy, and barely contained glee at the chili pepper revenge story. 20 years I've been waiting for you to see what he really is, she said, pouring wine despite the fact that it was barely noon. I just never imagined it would involve chemical warfare. Over the following weeks, David's humiliation spread through the Manchester cycling community with the efficiency of a particularly virulent gossip virus. The club's WhatsApp group had dubbed him Fire Saddle Dave, and the story of his mysterious cycling shorts malfunction had taken on a life of its own. Heard poor Dave had some kind of allergic reaction, Colin had posted, apparently unaware that the reaction was more sabotage than sensitivity. Never seen chili powder work so fast, replied another member. Poor bloke looked like he was riding on lava. The story grew with each retelling, as stories do. By the end of the week, David had allegedly suffered everything from a rare tropical disease to an encounter with aggressive wasps. The truth, that his wife had chemically modified his cycling shorts as revenge for adultery, never occurred to anyone because naturally it was too ridiculous to consider. David's performance anxiety around cycling became legendary. He apparently attended one more club ride but spent the entire time flinching whenever he had to sit down. His cycling buddies, being typical middle-aged men, found this endlessly amusing and helpful. "Just relax, Dave," they would call out. "It's only a bike seat, not a torture device." If only they knew. Meanwhile, I was discovering what life looked like without a husband who treated my cancer as a scheduling inconvenience. My treatment continued at Liverpool's Royal Hospital, where the oncology staff were impressed by my improved attitude and energy levels. "Whatever changes you've made in your life," Dr. Williams told me after my latest scan, "keep doing them. Your markers are improving faster than we expected." Apparently, removing toxic relationships was as beneficial to my health as removing toxic cells. Who would have thought? I joined a cancer support group in Liverpool, where I met other people fighting similar battles. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who understood that just sitting in a chair for chemotherapy was actually an exhausting experience that required emotional and physical resilience. "My husband keeps asking when I'll be back to normal," shared Patricia, a teacher undergoing treatment for breast cancer, as if normal is something you can schedule like a dental appointment. I found myself sharing the story of David's cycling priorities and Emma discovery. Though I kept the chili pepper revenge to myself, that felt like a private victory that didn't need public acknowledgement. The group became my new support system. People who celebrated small victories like keeping food down for an entire day or having enough energy to walk to the corner shop. They understood that surviving cancer wasn't just about medical treatment. It was about maintaining dignity and hope when everything in your body was working against you. 3 months later, I received the news every cancer patient hopes for. My latest scans were clear. The treatment had worked. I was officially in remission, which meant I could start planning a future that didn't revolve around chemotherapy schedules and side effects. Claire suggested we celebrate with a weekend trip to Edinburgh, and for the first time in a year, I said yes to something that had nothing to do with medical appointments or domestic obligations. We booked a hotel, planned restaurant visits, and I bought new clothes to replace the shapeless comfort wear that had become my uniform during treatment. It was while shopping for celebration outfits that I ran into Sarah Mitchell again, this time in John Lewis rather than Tesco. She approached with the cautious expression of someone who wasn't sure whether congratulations or condolences were appropriate. "Helen, you look wonderful," she said, which was generous considering I was still wearing scarves to cover my slowly regrowing hair. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you," I replied. The treatment worked. "That's fantastic news," she said, then hesitated. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with David? He seems different lately." Different was an interesting choice of words. I was curious to hear how David's new reality was affecting his public persona. "He's been having some problems with his cycling," Sarah continued. "Colin mentioned he's barely ridden with the club since that incident with his shorts, and he looks terrible, like he's not sleeping or eating properly." I felt a brief moment of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. David was experiencing the consequences of his choices, which was more than he had ever allowed me to do. "I'm afraid David and I are separated," I told Sarah, which was true in every sense that mattered. "We're working through some issues." "Oh," she said, clearly fishing for more details. "I hope you can work things out." "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should," I replied, which was as diplomatic as I could manage. After Sarah left, I realized I felt nothing about David's apparent decline. No satisfaction, no guilt, no desire to rescue him from his self-created problems. He had become irrelevant to my life in the way that former employers or old addresses become irrelevant. something that had once been important but no longer affected my daily existence. My hair grew back slowly, coming in curlier and slightly darker than before. Chemo curls, the nurses called it, a side effect that was actually an improvement. I liked my new hair, just as I was beginning to like my new life. I started volunteering at the Cancer Support Center in Liverpool, helping newly diagnosed patients navigate the maze of treatments and bureaucracy that came with a cancer diagnosis. It was rewarding work that used my nursing skills while giving me a sense of purpose that had been missing during my marriage. "You're so calm about everything," observed Michael, a recently diagnosed patient who was struggling with the fear and uncertainty that came with cancer. "How do you stay so positive?" "I learned that surviving cancer is easier when you're not simultaneously surviving toxic relationships," I replied. "Sometimes the treatment isn't just medical." 6 months into my remission, I received an unexpected visitor. David appeared at Claire's door on a Thursday evening, looking like he had lost a fight with his own life. He was thinner, pale, and wearing clothes that suggested he had given up caring about his appearance. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing on the doorstep like a door-to-door salesman with no confidence in his product. Claire invited him in with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for tax inspectors, then strategically withdrew to the kitchen where she could hear every word while pretending to organize her already organized cupboards. David sat across from me in Claire's living room, looking around at the cheerful chaos of a home where someone actually lived rather than just stored cycling equipment. He was clearly struggling to find an opening for whatever speech he had prepared. "You look good," he said finally. "Healthy." "I am healthy," I replied. "The cancer is gone." "That's wonderful news," he said, and for a moment he sounded like the man I had married. "I'm really glad." "Thank you." We sat in silence while David gathered his courage for whatever he had come to say. I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the person I had once loved, but seeing mainly a stranger who had aged badly. "Helen, I know I made mistakes," he began, which was already a vast understatement. "I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me most. I was selfish and stupid, and I hurt you terribly." I nodded, acknowledging that this was all true. "I ended things with Emma," he continued, "months ago. It was never serious anyway. I was just confused and scared about the cancer, and I made terrible choices." "I see," I said, wondering if he expected congratulations for ending an affair that should never have existed. "I want to come home," he said finally. "I want us to try again. I'll be different this time. I'll be the husband you deserved during the cancer treatment." I looked at this man who had abandoned me during the darkest period of my life, who had lied about where he was while I underwent chemotherapy alone, who had built a secret relationship while I fought for my survival. He was offering to be better now that I was no longer dying, now that supporting me wouldn't require any actual sacrifice. "David," I said gently, "do you know what I realized during treatment?" He shook his head. "I realized that I had been fighting 2 battles, one against cancer and one against the person who was supposed to be helping me fight cancer. The cancer was easier." "I know I let you down." "You didn't let me down," I interrupted. "You showed me exactly who you are when the situation requires more than superficial support. You're someone who prioritizes his hobby over his wife's life-threatening illness. You're someone who lies easily and often. You're someone who builds escape routes when he should be building support systems." David's face crumpled. "People change. I can change." "You're right," I said. "People do change. I changed. I learned that I don't need anyone who treats my cancer diagnosis as an inconvenience to their social calendar." "Helen, please. I love you." "You love the idea of having a wife," I corrected. "You love having someone to manage your domestic life while you pursue your interests. But you don't love me enough to sit with me during chemotherapy, and you certainly don't love me enough to remain faithful while I'm fighting for my life." We talked for another hour, with David becoming increasingly desperate and me becoming increasingly certain that I had made the right choice. He offered couples therapy, individual therapy, cycling cessation, and various other commitments that sounded impressive but felt hollow. "I'm not angry with you anymore, David," I said finally. "I'm grateful to you." He looked confused, as if gratitude was the last thing he had expected. "Grateful for showing me what I was settling for," I explained. "Grateful for forcing me to discover my own strength. Grateful for proving that I can survive anything. Cancer, betrayal, even 18 years of a marriage that was apparently much more one-sided than I realized." David left that evening with the defeated posture of someone who had gambled everything on a final play and lost. I watched him drive away and felt nothing but relief that this chapter of my life was finally, definitively closed. Claire emerged from the kitchen with wine and a look of deep satisfaction. "Well," she said, settling into her chair, "that was better than anything on television." "Was I too harsh?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I cared about the answer. "You were perfect," Claire replied. 18 years too late, but perfect. A year later, I was living in my own flat in Liverpool's Georgian Quarter, working part-time at the cancer center and full-time on building a life that belonged entirely to me. My hair had grown back completely, curlier and more interesting than before. I had energy I hadn't felt in years, and plans that didn't involve anyone else's approval or schedule. I started a small business baking pies for the local farmers market, Helen's Hope Pies, with a portion of profits going to cancer patient support services. It wasn't going to make me rich, but it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine for decades. The farmers market was where I met James, a recently retired teacher who was volunteering with a literacy program. He was kind, funny, and refreshingly uncomplicated. When I told him about my cancer history on our third coffee date, his response was to ask intelligent questions about my experience and offer genuine sympathy for what I had endured. "Your ex-husband sounds like he missed out on knowing an extraordinary woman," he said simply. It was the first time in years that someone had described me as extraordinary for something other than my ability to tolerate unacceptable behavior. James rode a bicycle, as it happened, but for transportation rather than identity. He owned one bike, bought secondhand, and used it to get to the library and local shops. He had never owned Lycra clothing and seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept of spending thousands of pounds on cycling equipment. "It gets you from point A to point B," he said when I mentioned David's former obsession. "I never understood making it more complicated than that." I found myself thinking about David occasionally, usually when I passed cycling shops or saw groups of middle-aged men in Lycra attempting to recapture their athletic youth. I wondered if he was still cycling, if he had found someone new to finance his hobby, if he ever thought about the wife he had abandoned during her cancer treatment. The answer came unexpectedly when Sarah Mitchell called me 6 months later. "I hope you don't mind," she said, "but I thought you should know. David's been asking people about you, where you're living, if you're seeing anyone, that sort of thing." "What kind of asking?" I inquired, curious rather than concerned. "Desperate asking," Sarah replied. "Apparently things haven't gone well for him since you left. He lost his job a few months ago, something about drinking and poor performance, and he's had to sell the house." I absorbed this information with the detached interest I might feel about a news story involving strangers. David's decline was sad in the abstract way that any human suffering was sad, but it didn't affect me personally. "Colin says he hasn't been to club rides in months," Sarah continued, "and when he does show up, he's different, bitter. Keeps complaining about how unfairly life has treated him." Unfairly. The man who had committed adultery while his wife underwent chemotherapy felt that life had treated him unfairly. The irony was so perfect, it almost deserved applause. "I hope he finds whatever he's looking for," I told Sarah, meaning it in the most general possible way. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked suddenly. "You sound different too, but in a good way." I considered the question. Was I happy? I was certainly healthier, both physically and emotionally. I was building relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. I was pursuing interests that belonged to me rather than supporting someone else's pursuits. I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would avoid conflict. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "I'm very happy." 2 years into my new life, I received one final communication from David. Not a phone call or visit, but a letter delivered to the cancer center where I volunteered. He had apparently tracked down my location through the kind of persistent investigation that would have been touching if it had been applied to our marriage. The letter was 3 pages of handwriting that deteriorated from careful script to desperate scrawl. David apologized again, explained his regrets again, and begged for another chance again. But the core message was new. He had been diagnosed with depression and was attending therapy where he had learned about his mistakes. "I understand now that I was emotionally unavailable during your cancer treatment," he wrote, as if emotional unavailability was what we called adultery and abandonment these days. "I realize I wasn't the partner you needed, and I'm working on becoming a better person." The letter concluded with an offer to start fresh and build the marriage we should have had from the beginning. He had apparently learned enough therapy language to dress up his selfishness in psychological terminology, but the fundamental message remained the same. He wanted me to come back and resume the role of the wife who managed his domestic life while he pursued his interests. I read the letter twice, then filed it in my kitchen recycling bin where it belonged. That evening, James and I were cooking dinner together in my small kitchen. A simple routine that had become precious to me precisely because it was uncomplicated. He didn't require performance or pretense. He enjoyed my company when I was tired, grumpy, or simply quiet. He had seen me on my worst days and somehow concluded I was worth spending time with anyway. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing my thoughtful mood. "David sent a letter," I explained, summarizing the contents while I chopped vegetables for our stir-fry. James listened without interrupting, then asked the question that mattered. "How do you feel about it?" "Nothing," I replied, realizing it was true. "I feel nothing about it. It's like getting a letter from someone I barely remember." "That's probably healthy," James said, adding garlic to the pan with the casual competence of someone who had been cooking for himself for decades rather than expecting to be fed by others. "I think," I said slowly, "that David never understood that I fell in love with the person I thought he was, not the person he actually was. When I finally saw who he really was, there was nothing left to love." "And now?" James asked, stirring vegetables with the attention they deserved. "Now I know the difference between settling for someone and choosing someone," I replied. "I spent 18 years settling. I'm never doing that again." We ate dinner and talked about James's literacy students, my pie baking experiments, and plans for a weekend trip to the Lake District. Normal conversation between two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and didn't require drama to feel connected. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. My hair was completely grown back, thick and curly and more interesting than it had ever been. My face had color and energy that had nothing to do with makeup or youth. I looked like someone who had fought battles and won, someone who had discovered her own strength and decided to use it wisely. I thought about the woman I had been 2 years ago, desperate for approval, afraid of conflict, accepting crumbs of affection because I believed that was all I deserved. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered with sympathy but couldn't imagine becoming again. The next morning was Saturday, and I was setting up my pie stall at the farmer's market when I saw a familiar figure browsing the vendor booths. David was thinner than I remembered, gray around the edges, moving with the careful posture of someone who had lost confidence in his place in the world. He hadn't seen me yet, and I watched him examining handmade soaps and organic vegetables with the aimless attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. His cycling clothes had been replaced by ordinary, casual wear that looked like it had been purchased without enthusiasm. The athletic swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like defeat. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy that had kept me married for 18 years. The impulse to fix, to heal, to make everything better for someone who was clearly struggling. Then I remembered sitting alone during chemotherapy sessions while he trained for cycling events, and the sympathy evaporated. David eventually noticed my stall, and our eyes met across the market. His expression cycled through surprise, hope, and something that might have been shame. He approached slowly, like someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. "Helen," he said simply. "Hello, David." We looked at each other across my display of pies, two people who had once shared a life and now had nothing in common except history. "You look wonderful," he said, and meant it. "Thank you. I feel wonderful." "I sent you a letter." "I received it," I interrupted gently. "Thank you for the apology." He waited for more, but there wasn't more. The conversation had already lasted longer than necessary. "Helen," he said finally, "I know I don't deserve another chance, but—" "You're right," I said calmly. "You don't deserve another chance. But more importantly, I don't want to give you one." The words hung between us with the finality of a door closing. David's face showed that he had received the message clearly. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, meaning it as generously as I could manage. "I thought I had," he replied quietly. "You did have it," I corrected, "but you threw it away for cycling shorts and weekend getaways with Emma. Those were your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." David nodded slowly, the last of his hope finally extinguished. He walked away without another word, disappearing into the crowd of people who were building lives instead of destroying them. I sold 17 pies that morning, including 3 to James's literacy students who had come to support my business. The market was busy and cheerful, full of people who had chosen to spend their Saturday supporting local vendors and building community connections. As I packed up my remaining inventory, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I had been dying of cancer and married to a man who treated my illness as an inconvenience. Today, I was healthy, independent, and surrounded by people who valued my presence rather than simply tolerating it. The chili pepper revenge felt like ancient history now, a moment of justified anger that had marked the beginning of my transformation, rather than its conclusion. David's humiliation had been satisfying in the moment, but my real victory was the life I had built afterward, a life that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with choices I had made for myself. I drove home through Liverpool's afternoon sunshine, thinking about dinner plans with James and a new pie recipe I wanted to try. Simple pleasures that belonged entirely to me, earned through surviving both cancer and the kind of marriage that slowly kills your spirit. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "How was the market today?" "Perfect," I replied, and realized I meant it completely. That evening, James and I walked along the Mersey waterfront talking about everything and nothing while the sun set over the water. We had been together for over a year, and he still seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. He still held my hand while we walked, not from obligation or habit, but because he enjoyed the connection. "You're quiet tonight," he observed. "Everything all right?" "I saw David at the market today," I explained. "How was that?" "Final," I said, like closing a book I'd already finished reading. James squeezed my hand. "Any regrets?" I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the 18 years of marriage that had ended so badly? Did I regret the cancer that had revealed David's true character? Did I regret the chili pepper revenge that had marked the beginning of my independence? "No regrets," I said finally. "Everything that happened led me here, and here is exactly where I want to be." We walked in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other after learning the difference between need and choice, between settling and selecting, between surviving and thriving. My name is Helen Morrison. I'm 51 years old, 2 years cancer-free, and completely in charge of my own life. I learned that true strength isn't about enduring unacceptable situations. It's about changing them. Cancer tested my body and showed me I was tougher than I knew. David's betrayal tested my spirit and taught me I was worth more than I had believed. But I found my real strength in the fire I lit under my own life, the kind that burns clean and bright and never, ever goes out. And sometimes, late at night when I'm feeling particularly wicked, I still smile thinking about David trying to explain to his cycling club why he couldn't sit down properly for a week. After all, everyone deserves to discover their own personal version of justice, even if it comes with a side of scotch bonnet chilies.